Hi everyone. So just a little bit of my background. I've sold, 4 software companies, and currently just got out my 2-year with CA, which was my golden handcuffs fell off, and I left. So there you go. And the following day I started another company called Curiosity Software Ireland, where we're just creating some fun stuff at the moment. So don't worry about it. I'll tell you about it some other day. It's fine. So I've been also doing a lot of work with some very large customers all for CA. I was kind of their DevOps lead, really, in terms of strategy, thought, how they go out and how they approach DevOps. Is it DevOps? Is it continuous testing? Is it continuous delivery? There's so many terms out there. They change every time a new marketing guy comes in. They change the terminology and so forth. So the first thing is, there's a good friend of mine from Gloucestershire. Every time someone dropped a car and asked him directions, he said, "I wouldn't start from here, mate. You'd start from somewhere else." So the problem is that when you're trying to bring something new into an organization, there's so much technical debt, there's so much legacy, there's so many bad practices, there's so much, so just talking about it, there's so many silos right, left and center that it's just virtually impossible to try and bring in these kind of new techniques and new technologies. And you're continually selling. You're constantly selling all the time. Cross teams, you sell them a product. You've sold your first 3 products, right? Now you're going to say, we've landed, now we're going to expand. No, you're not, mate. You've got to go the selling again. You've got to get over to the next silo. You've got to do that kind of selling as well. And I think that's really kind of one of the biggest problems is there's so much vested interest wherever you go that it's very difficult to kind of come across with all this stuff. And I think that's probably why it's still seen as a little bit of a niche when we're talking to you. It's still seen as a little bit of a niche thing, really. I would also add that I think the costs are coming down, therefore, why are you all here? Shouldn't you go off and do something where there's a lot more money? So that's another thing to think about. Most companies are still struggling with the tech and the vision. So the tech, say for example, there are large software companies out there that have been producing for service virtualization for ages, and they've come barreling in. How good's the tech? Pretty average, to be honest. There's still a lot of hacking and editing. I'm still finding quote, ampersand, quote, left space, quote, variable name, ampersand, is that real in this day and age? Are we still writing scripts like that to get a response that actually responds in something that's a little more organized? So I think the tech is pretty clunky out there in terms of what's out there. However, with you guys and what's happening now, it's changed dramatically, I would say, over the last probably year in terms of what I've seen. The ability to drop it onto a web screen, bingo, it explodes what the request responses are, the API types, the Swagger definitions. You can put some kind of intelligence in it. You can spin it up and you can respond to it. You can push it with a REST call. You can poke it so that it responds in certain different ways. And you can easily play around with latency and all those types of things like that. So the tech is there. I think what's actually missing is the vision. And that's the big thing that that I spend a lot of time doing, going with companies and just sitting there and saying, what the hell are you trying to do here? You're spending an absolute fortune here, whereas actually, if you fix this, that would solve that problem. And most of you are going to think it's service virtualization, but the answer was actually the requirements. The requirements are so dismal that you couldn't really get a virtual service out of it, you couldn't get the test data out of it, you couldn't get the requirements out of it. So I would always be taking them to somewhere else. But actually there is a great, they're all going to go bust otherwise, because these startups, people who come in without, I wouldn't start from here, mate, because they don't have the baggage. I've started Curiosity, and in probably 2 months, I've created some amazing software by bolting stuff together, and assembling stuff and not having the baggage. So it's great. It's really great to be able to start fresh, So I think having that vision is critical. And you've got to get it in at the CIO level. You've got to get it up high, otherwise it's just not going to. It's just you're constantly fighting upstream and you're being battered back, and there's all the various different problems with that. They also don't know where they are and what they have. So in terms of they don't understand, if you look at most legacy systems, there's mainframes, there's MQ messages flying around right, left, and center. They have no idea what's in them. I did a big thing for a bank in Boston, and basically we created these pivot tables for them, spot diagrams, showing them what they had. And we were comparing, and we took the messages, shredded them, basically created diagrams. This is what you have in the Japanese market, this is what you have, and then basically would have masses and masses of data, but very little spread in terms of the actual differences in data. So then you say, well, actually, if we could fill in all the gaps and create those as virtual MQ messages, what would you reckon? Brilliant, that would be fantastic. That means we would stop all these bugs, and each bug was a reputational damage to them. It was an absolute reputational damage because it was a fund that failed for a customer. So they didn't have the fund configurations in there. Now all of that can be virtualized, but they didn't have the nous to understand what the comparison of the variables were, first of all, and to understand the differences and the narrowness of the data that they were working with, because everyone just uses production data. And production data is just useless for all of the stuff that we're really talking about. So technical debt, as I just talked about, and the other one is siloed knowledge. Knowledge just does not flow around. Now, any of you work for any of the big SIs? Good. So one of the problems, knowledge is power. People are not very keen on giving knowledge outside of the silo they're in because that's money. They will answer a direct question, but they're not going to go forth and give you nice pieces of information. So having knowledge of a particular service of a certain API, actually they're not that really keen unless they're forced and dragged to the well and told to form these standards. And I don't know the number of companies have gone and said, right, let's have a look at your dictionary. You've come in and you've told us that you create a dictionary which links to the HP product set, but I want to see it so I can then interface with your APIs. Oh, well, can you tell us which API you want to look at? No, I just want to look at the dictionary so I can browse it. No, you have to tell us which API. I'm like, look, you work for the company, I work for the company, give me the information. And they won't give me the information. So, you've got to, SV sounds good, but because of the economics, which is driving it, which is, the reality is that a lot of the SIs like more inefficient products because they can make more money out of them, because they can add bodies to them and create a service. Now, I've heard $200,000 to virtualize one service, cross-company. Sound about right? Maybe about 50 methods in it. Something like about 200 grand. So they just said, no, we won't bother. Didn't bother. And they just basically hacked it. Bit of code in there, if statement, if debug mode, return this, because it just wasn't worth it. And also it would take them, another one was, we said, well, look, we've got a tool, we can drop it in, we could probably have all of these services virtualized by Christmas. And they said, no, we've outsourced it. They're going to do it. We're now in November, this was last Christmas, and they've got about a third of the way through. Meanwhile, the customer's going nowhere, So, but there's the economics imperatives which are pulling this apart are really important. You've got to kind of understand those when you're trying to get this stuff working in your company. So, right, let's just see what happens. Okay, clicking it. Let's just try this. Okay, so when you're trying to build DevOps, what you're really trying to do is get your requirements and code and tests as close together as possible. So I make a change to my requirements, I change a user story, or I come out with a news story. The code, which requirement is linked to which code. It's all linked in Git. You've got every single piece of the requirement clearly defined. You've got terminology. Don't smile. It can be done. You've got terminology in there like a swap. Swap has something like 190 meanings, but you know which swap you're using in terms of that. There's a lovely company called Huw in Holland, which I spent a lot of time with building these things. But if you can then link that to actually specific pieces of code, fantastic, which means if you change the code, you know which requirements are fasted. The other one is test. The test fails, so you know which code it's linked to, but you also know which requirements it's linked to. So the trying to get that is the reality of what you're actually trying to do with everything that we're up to. I mean, in here you're talking about tests making them better, but actually the requirements, the virtualization, which is part of the test, needs to fully understand the requirements so you can virtualize decision gates. So requirement says if the credit rating is below this, you need to check if they've got a previous history. Now that's a response, okay? That's actually data which is created, but it's part of a requirement. So you've got to map the virtualization to the requirement, okay? And that's, I invented a product called Agile Designer, which basically did that. And I'll show you a quick picture of it at the end. Now, what actually you have is just, it's just like, they've just, it actually works better on yours.
I mean, that's deliberate, isn't it?
Yeah. It's just like, you know, it's just like we've got a bit of cod. We've got a bit of cod over there, so I think that's kind of, you know, where you're at. Anyway, some quick wins. So I mean, I've only got 15 minutes, obviously, so I'm just going to give you some ideas. So there's a lot of really good stuff out there, and having seen, you know, in my 2 months since I've left, how quickly you can build solutions, you know. It is miraculous how quickly you can assemble a solution. And if you've got good people, good management, a little bit of money, and you can prove as you're going along, you know, and in my point, I mean, at the moment, we're building our own DevOps solution to test our own software, because it's just easier to do that. We're actually going to sell it, and we're going to ship it with a product. I could probably go into Nationwide and say, do you want to look at our DevOps? And they go, oh, Christ, we'll have that one. You know, because ours has got more features in it. We've got links to code quality engines, you know, all of that stuff. And it might be easier, especially if our will also be API-able, so you can plug in bits of it as well. So I think that strategy is, you know, has kind of, it is almost a better way to go. Just kind of build the perfect one, as long as you do it in a reasonable time, and then attach it into your existing ones, you know. So there's some of those things to think about. Now, the vision, you know, the thing, my specialty area was test data. I've been working in it for, I don't know, 15 years, creating all sorts of different combinations of test data and understanding it, negative, positive, you know, volume, all that kind of stuff. And one of the key things that we found there was this ability to break up data journeys, okay? So, you know, you talk about end-to-end tests. I mean, we were talking to a large healthcare provider in the US, and I mean, you've got sort of 200 systems, literally going from a really cool phone app to get all the way through to a payment, you know, all payments being made across the system. And actually what we did is, we just, it was kind of a really easy trick. We created this little product called DB Compare, and I think it still exists, and we snapped the databases. So we were constantly snapping the databases behind it. And we could also shred messages. So a message would come in and we would turn it into a SQL Server database. Then we would run the app, okay, which was in this case was a phone app. That then went through some preliminary databases. We snapped the differences, but we also snapped the messages. So for every interaction on the phone, we knew the before and after, okay? Now, if you think about that, you can remove that entire part of the system now, because all you need to do is replay that data into that system, which then drives the next part of the system. So by doing that concept with the data, and it's not just the virtualization, it's actually, and snapping it before and afterwards it paid off some of the technical debt, because they didn't know what the systems did. You know, they pressed this button and you went, oh, did you realize it posted over here? No. They had no clue that some of these things were happening. But when you actually look at the raw database and you look at the logs, it's really useful to do that. So spending some time having this snap technology in, and that includes your virtualization, because virtualization does a lot of recording, and actually, you know, giving them something meaningful was actually mind-blowing for them, because it completely changed their entire testing strategy, you know, and that could totally change everything. And the other thing that the problem you have is version management. APIs, everyone forgets about version compatibility. It's, you know, it's all very well saying I've got an API which I can virtualize, but how many people are using it? And does it reject, if an earlier version is calling a later version, does it detect it's a later version and say, I don't know what to do with it? So that's a test. That's the type of test. No one ever does it. You know, there's no catalog of version compatibility, and you need to include that. The only way you can do that is with virtualization. It's impossible to do it, otherwise you've got to set up every single version of every single system talking to every other single system, you know. So there's all those types of things to think about it. The other one is risk. Now, everyone loves talking about risk. It's brilliant. You know, you say, oh, we're going to talk about risk-based testing, and everyone goes, whoa, fantastic, we want some of that. But then you actually try and, they don't really know what they mean by risk. You know, it's all of those subjective things that, you know, it's a really important application that Theresa May is going to demo live, you know, about the new NHS payment system. Now, you probably want it to all go wrong, but it would be fairly dramatic if it didn't. So in terms of the importance, there is a high risk. You have lots of systems which are actually pretty stable and low use and low report, and their reporting capabilities internally. So you've got to categorize all your systems, you've got to categorize all your interfaces, and then you've got to categorize the different types of tests you're doing, you've got to categorize the amount of time you've got. So I was actually, where were we? I was in a bar somewhere around here talking to one of my guys who works for me who did an econometrics masters, and he basically said it's full econometrics. You've just got to think about it and use econometrics modeling to be able to do this. So when you're thinking about virtual services, you've got to think about them in terms of what risk profile am I trying to test here? You know, you've got to make sure that everything's categorized, everything walks up and down the journey of the DevOps journey, and that means going backwards, not just forwards as well. Okay, I mean, again, it's only 15 minutes, so I'll leave it hanging there for the moment. What else have we got here? Press it several times. Okay. Okay, so virtualization and test data, fast services on demand, just in time, or sprint -1. So one of the big things that we used to do with the test data teams, which is, to be honest, virtualization is a subsetting of test data, because test data is a much bigger space. You've got a lot more protocols and things to worry about. So one of the things we managed to successfully do was to say, before a sprint starts, you've had your test data team come in, and they know the requirements, they've seen the sprint boards. And what we're going to do is we're going to prep the data ready for the team. And that is going to contain all of the different combinations of currencies, cross countries, swaps, different types of account types. So to be honest, it wasn't, I need to find data. You pretty much knew the data was there already. And we would create data indexes, which you can do exactly the same thing with virtual services. You can create these indexes where they go, and it's like a shopping cart, and you've just filled them in. I go down this aisle, I want this type of response, but I want to go and turn right, and I want it to be that, and I need it to be green, and I need it to be 5 mil. You've already built it. So that kind of, instead of self-service, thinking ahead of the team makes a big difference. You know, having that pre-think and getting involved, which is people, process, tools, there's of course politics, but getting the people and the process organized so you're doing things earlier, especially around virtualization, makes such a difference. Because then later on it's too late. The developers need it, and they've already moved on, and because they're clever, they'll just code it. They'll just code the if statement in, you know. The other one is mathematics and models. You know, 2 switches, A and B, and you want to set them to all combinations. Okay, so it's 2 to the power of 6, but then you care about the order which you do it. It's 2 to the power of 6 factorial, okay, which is 64 factorial, which is trillions of universes of universes of universes of atoms. So you've got to remember that it's once you start going n times n times n, forget it. So you have to use modeling to reduce it down, and that's kind of where you get into. There's things like all pairs, constrained all pairs, but actually you need to get into some of the things you do with graphing things, which is to do with data journeys, which is what you use on your sat navs, making sure you've gone through every junction, you're testing every junction, sometimes combinations of junctions. Mathematics and modeling is very important. The other thing that we used to do with virtualization, well, I guess they're still doing it, is this idea of a snowflake response. So you take a method, it's got a request and a response, and what you would do is you would say, well, we're going to have one person with one change of address. We're going to have one person with one married, one child, one person married with no child, one married with a husband with a child, and we basically created all of the different combinations, and we put them again, and we would just literally say, here's your response, bang. We call them a snowflake response. Now that could include, we've included some latency, we'd include some faults. So all of the responses were in there. It's never all. It sounds good because of just the complexity of it. But you could also play with the data. You could make sure you have different currency codes and all the rest of it. And we would just create vast arrays of these and put them in. So there you go, use those. They would also create a really simple index, and people would then just go and hunt in the index for the response that they want. And then they would map the test case to the characteristics of the response they wanted, and we would find the actual response. We would allocate the account number to it. So you're not thinking in terms of, this account number means this anymore. You're thinking, I want this type of data. Once you have it as a business term, you can then link it back to the requirements, because the requirements should map to the data, or inside the leaf or inside the actual node itself. Okay. So that was the snowflake response, and then the other thing. I've been banging on this about for ages, and I'm pretty much getting nowhere anyway. I'm talking to a company called XMLdation this next week. You ever heard of them? So what they're working on is the idea of a certification for an actual an API, basically. Now they're working in a very specific industry sector. So you go to them, and they will certify it for you. It's kind of a cloud-based product, but what does certification mean? It means I can react to it, but to do it, you need to be able to give them a set of request responses which you prove your product can work against. So you need a set of test harnesses against it. You also need a set of virtual versions against it. Once you've done that, then I agree you're certified against it. So that's really the only way this API world is going to work, is if there's an agreed standard. And if you try and plug into something, because you're plugging into something else, and you're assuming that I'm certifying that I certify against someone else, it's a bit like Brexit. It's going to be not very nice when we break it. So, but if you have that certification downstream and chain it together, then, and there's all sorts of things. There's regulation you can roll in this as well, because regulation varies as well. So, depending on which area, which type of industry you're in. If you're into medical devices, if you're actually into banking and blockchain, it's kind of a similar type of thing. You've got to think in terms of that certification type process. Now, I think that's a big gap in the market there at the moment, and no one's really grabbed that. So it's to take these products and move them on to the next level, link them into testing, link them into virtualization, link them into modeling, link them into coverage and things like that. Okay, so that's kind of what I've been banging on, and to a certain extent, I've accomplished a lot of this with customers. I have never managed all of it with one customer. Okay. So just in terms of modeling, this is a product I created called Agile Designer. And the idea behind this was that we would model the core characteristics of, it could be, in this case, it's Notepad++, just the opening closing. But if you look at the understanding an API is pretty useless. You take a Swagger thing and it's literally, all you're doing is just negative and positive testing of the variables. You're not linking it to the process that comes out of the other end. I need to call this API, I need to send this. I need to push this into that database, I need to post that message, I need to receive this. This needs to come back up. Because once you've got a definition or a model of it, you can then calculate the paths through it, and you might have a couple 100,000 paths, and you might end up with maybe 1,000 test cases to test the different combinations or routes or journeys through that. And that's where modeling comes into it. And that's the bit that is very much forgotten when it comes to defining coverage, that people really don't understand. Have you tested that decision gate? And we would continually go in and find the average was between 5 and 20% on a good day in terms of test case design that had been designed by hand. Okay, and that was a very happy path. Negative testing, forget it. It was down in the 0.0002s. So I think this idea of having a model driving the virtual service is kind of something that's, again, and that's the bit that we're actually working on at the moment, is to try and join all of these different technologies together. Okay. All right, probably went over 15 there. Sorry about that. Okay, was that random enough for you?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Fine. Okay.
There's some time for questions, actually.
Okay. Okay. Any questions? All sounds good. Come on. I'm waiting for you. Yeah.
This looks like protocol testing.
Yeah. Okay.
Because it's not just a single endpoint or exchange. I need to know what state you're in.
Yeah.
Or different state you're in or presenting. So IAC, UNAC, IAC again. Then
Yeah.
Switch channel.
Yeah.
We're going to say this port. You name the port. I respond. It's like VHF.
Yeah, I mean, it's a model. I mean, you're talking about a specific type of model. You're talking about a model of a particular type of testing here. I mean, in the APIs that I was dealing with in sort of healthcare, it was, you're setting up a doctor's visit, which sounds simple, but then, out of that there is an entire model of the different criteria that needs to go on with that. And then if you look about how do I test that, a lot of that is linking with other systems, all of which need to be virtualized. If I need to go down a decision gate, I need to make sure that I have all of the different responders for that particular one test case, which I'm only trying to test this small chunk over here, but for me to get there, I've got to create all of these journeys and all of these kind of like bounces off with my virtual services. And I haven't got time to go and to sit there and create all those responses, and people just have their favorite responses and they just constantly hacking them. It should be part of the model. You defining the model to test this. The testability, people when they build systems need to understand the system needs to be testable. So you need to design the testability into the system, and that includes breadcrumbs, and that comes back to software design at the beginning and all those types of things. So there's a lot more to it than just kind of winging it and this kind of reactive hope for the best type of thing, which is where we are, I wouldn't start from here type of thing. Okay, sorry, a question?
I noticed you had the triangle of requirements, code and test, and wondered whether you need to have a fourth point of audit, because it sounds like a lot of what you're doing is audit.
It's a very good question, actually. One of the big problems is the dependency map between them, and I think, there's a lot you could put in there, regulation and all sorts of things, but I mean, I think where do you get the dependency map when you're starting today? You know, because you've got a whole bunch of MQ messages which were written in assembler, so you haven't got access to the code. You know, so what the hell do we do? You know, so you've got to work out, if I change this over here, what happens over here? Which is why we developed just like a load of techniques with all of this snapshotting, you know, all of these probes. You know, SV actually did have this product which was quite good. Lisa, I forget what it's called, which basically traced the messages through and created this data journey, which is in effect what you're trying to do. But no one's really, you know, that sort of died a bit of a death. But I think that's a really cool idea, being able to understand that dependency map, because a service sits on its own. You don't know what's calling it, where it's coming from. And without that dependency map or that audit, you know, people hoped with HP ALM they would have the audit. But it was such chaos that went in, it's just chaos coming out. You know, if you look at some of the, there's a good product company called Semel, who do code quality, but they also create a dictionary of code dependencies. So you make a change to a single line of code, which is in a class, which is used, you know, which is instantiated in 45 different things. Then suddenly you've got a dependency map. Now that's fine in code level. You know, Microsoft's a bit better at this because of the .NET framework, but there's nothing about what messages are calling it, you know, and the history of messages. Facebook's great because it allows you only 3 versions. If you call it and you call it with the format for version 4, and they've upgraded the it'll just say go away, it won't respond to you, you know. So because they've got a captive market, you haven't got that in a bank, you know. Someone could just be calling you, it's just sitting there, you know. You've upgraded it, and all hell breaks loose, you know. And that's why they don't trust us, because, you know, you press a small button over here, and the canning line shuts down. I mean, I think, was it a large supermarket, they decided to put mandarins in a bag, and they shut the entire point of sale down for a day. It's classic. It's really good, isn't it? Because of the SKU for a single mandarin and the SKU for a bag caused absolute carnage. I'll tell you which one it was. Yeah. So I mean, you know, and that comes from they didn't know the dependencies up and down the systems. Yeah. So okay, is that all right? Enough for now. Okay. Oh, sorry. Yeah. That would be you.
Just wondering, like in the kind of complex systems you were talking about testing, how you deal with changes in the APIs on which you've already virtualized the service. What strategies you use to keep them in sync?
What I was hoping, I haven't seen anyone do it in any systematic way, to be honest. And that's why I thought really there's a bit of a market out there. I mean, there's all these tools where you can register the APIs and all those kind of things, but I haven't really seen anyone who's done anything. I mean, you just kind of cobble it together with a bit of Git and hope for the best, really. You know, which is not good, is it? You know, so I mean, and
I suppose curious.
Yeah, exactly. You know, I mean, you know, some people have had good intentions and they've tried, but I haven't really come across anyone I've gone, wow, that's phenomenal.
So it's like a manual process at the minute. If
yeah,
change,
you know, with a few bit
models or the outputs of those.
And hope for the best. Yeah. But I mean, again, you see, we're here to sort of discuss opportunities. Where you know, so that's one that I've spotted. Okay. All right. Okay. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Fine. Thanks.